The Brazilian parliament voted in late September to impeach President Fernando Collor, who 2 years earlier had become the country's first democratically elected leader in nearly 30 years, on charges of corruption. Collor's presidential powers were suspended for the duration of the trial, and his deputy, Itamar Franco, took over as acting president. Franco had actually fallen out with Collor over the president's economic policies and had left the governing National Reconstruction Party early in the year. But by late December it was looking pretty likely that Collor would be convicted and removed from office, to forestall which he resigned himself on the 29th of December, giving Franco the job full-time. On an episode of Saturday Night Live, Irish singer-songwriter Sinead O'Connor, performing a cover version of Bob Marley's song War, tore up a picture of Pope John Paul II, saying, "Fight the real enemy." Asked about it later, she blamed the Catholic Church as a whole for the abuse, physical, sexual and emotional, she herself had suffered as a child, as well as for complicity in genocides and other crimes during the Age of Discovery, and for systematically covering up the widespread abuse of children by priests. Needless to say, this all stoked a massive controversy, with hundreds of calls to NBC criticising O'Connor, who was banned for life from the network and became either a joke or hate figure for many around the world. The 16-year-long Mozambican civil war came to an end with a peace accord signed in Rome between the government and Renamo, the national resistance movement. The government had begun life as Frelimo, a Marxist guerrilla movement fighting for independence from Portugal, but other independence groups had remained opposed to their plans for a one-party communist state. During the Cold War, the Frelimo government was supported by the USSR and the opposition by apartheid South Africa, but with both regimes now gone and most of the country in ruins, the groups agreed to make peace with a clean slate, no prosecutions or punishments, and Renamo men being given 50% of the positions in the Mozambican army. The president of Mozambique was certainly an interesting character, having been a founding member of Frelimo and taken office in 1986 when his predecessor's plane crashed in mysterious circumstances, but he'd recently got into transcendental meditation and yogic flying and was introducing it to all his government officials, and a couple of years later he would mandate daily meditation for all police and military. The last Yugoslav army troops finally left Croatia as the war in neighbouring Bosnia continued to spiral. As Bosnian Serb militia backed by Belgrade besieged Sarajevo, firing mortars and artillery into the city and sniping at residents as they went about their lives, tensions had also developed between the Bosnian and Croatian governments, especially over the status of the self-proclaimed Bosnian Croat state of Herceg Bosna. Like the Bosnian Serb Republika Srpska, the government of Herceg Bosna wished to join their parent community rather than have full independence, while the Bosnian government insisted that they were both part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. An attempt to come to some kind of compromise to allow all parties to concentrate on securing Bosnian independence fell apart, and Croatian and Bosnian forces began not only fighting each other, but evacuating members of the other ethnicity to try and remove rival claims to the area. In fact, a term originating with a Russian journalist covering the conflict was beginning to come into use to describe these kinds of forced population movements: ethnic cleansing. The first US presidential debates took place between the three candidates and their running mates, President George Bush and Dan Quayle for the Republicans, Bill Clinton and Al Gore for the Democrats, and the independents Ross Perot and James Stockdale. And British TV viewers waking up the morning after the Portuguese Grand Prix could have caught the first episode of Channel 4's new anarchic morning show, The Big Breakfast, filmed in a set of old lockkeepers' cottages in Bow, East London, which would make a star of its co-host Chris Evans. Not that one. Early in October, the F1 world was saddened by the sudden death of 1967 world champion Denny Hulme. He'd had a massive heart attack while driving in the Bathurst 1,000 kilometres, managed to steer his car off the track before losing consciousness. The definition of a gentle giant, his powerful physique giving him the name Denny the Bear, but soft-spoken and undemonstrative, Hulme had helped the McLaren team recover from the death of its founder in 1970 and begin to transform into the winning team of Fittipaldi, Hunt and later Prost, Lauda and Senna. Back to the present and indeed the future, as Max Mosley was re-elected president of FISA with full powers to sit down with Bernie Ecclestone as commercial rights holder and negotiate a new Concord agreement. Not only that, but he'd also said that when Jean-Marie Balestra's term as FIA president ended in 1993, he wanted to actually merge the two organisations. For now, though, there was still the ongoing wrangle over fuel formulas for next year, with ELF revealing that Mansell's win in Portugal was fuelled by a mix including ethanol derived from sugar beet, and indeed that substance could be found in pump petrol. all of which was just to muddy the waters about exactly what pump petrol really meant, and how to define exactly what chemical makeup it should have, which was of course the point. The fuel manufacturers didn't want to be restricted, but to use F1 as a testbed for innovation, while the governing body was more concerned with competition within the sport and affordability for teams. The game of musical chairs continued meanwhile as Derek Warwick announced that he would be returning to F1 and indeed to the Arrows team, for whom he'd driven from 1987 to 89, even though they were now called Footwork. Warwick had been a well-liked figure during the 80s in F1 and had had a brilliant couple of years in sports cars to boot, so this was a popular announcement. He would be replacing Michele Alboreto, who was confirmed as the new lead driver for Scuderia Italia, where he would mentor the rookie Luca Badoer. Eddie Jordan's ongoing dispute with Cosworth over wrongful termination of the contract had been settled in the latter's favour, leaving a despairing EJ another $2 million out of pocket, even as he announced his new engine partnership with Brian Hart, who was building a new V10. Though there were also rumours that Ron Dennis was sniffing around with a view to swiping that deal out from under him. Yamaha, for their part, would ditch the disastrous V12 that had powered this year's Jordan and instead link up with John Judd to build them a bespoke V10, which will go in the back of the Tyrrell car, with Ukio Katayama and his considerable cabin sponsorship moving over from Larousse to give Yamaha a Japanese driver to announce in Suzuka. Tyrrell's gain was Larousse's loss, at least in terms of financing, but Yoshitoshi Doi of Central Park promised to cover the difference until a new driver could be found, so the other French team looked like they might after all make the grid in 1993. The big questions were, of course, still who would partner Alain Prost at Williams, and what would Ayrton Senna do. The three drivers allegedly on Frank and Patrick's shortlist were Riccardo Patrese, if he could be negotiated back out of his Benetton contract, test driver Damon Hill, a favourite of Patrick Head, and Mika Hakkinen, who had just signed a Lotus contract for 1993, but that was nothing a few million couldn't fix. Mansell had come out in support of Hill, saying he had the capacity to beat Prost. No pressure, Damon. While word was that Martin Brundle had been definitely told he wouldn't get the drive, and some of the wilder rumours had Al Unser Jr. on the radar too. Senna, for his part, was keeping quiet except for the occasional outburst about Prost, and saying he'd have to wait and see what engines Ron Dennis could arrange, and taking every opportunity to disclaim his current performances as the best he could do with the machinery, which must have tested his relationship with the team. And Keith Wiggins of the Pacific team announced that their entry in F1 had been put back to 1994 to give them some more time to raise the necessary budget, so it looked like there would just be the Sauber team joining the grid, with ongoing question marks about whether Brabham would make the start of the season. There were two new faces in the paddock in Suzuka too, or rather, two returning faces. Nicola Larini replaced Ivan Capelli in the number 28 Ferrari, working on the new gearbox and active suspension, and March welcomed Dutch veteran Jan Lammers, returning after over 10 years away from F1. Car 16, Jan Lammers. After a few seasons struggling with uncompetitive Shadow, Ensign, ATS and Theodore cars in the late 70s and early 80s, Lammers had been let go by the latter after the Dutch Grand Prix in 1982, ironically the only one of his 6 entries that he'd managed to qualify. Since then, though, he'd found success in other series, particularly sports car racing, where he'd developed a productive relationship with Tom Walkinshaw, for whom he'd come second in the World Sports Car Championship in 1987, won Le Mans in 1988, co-driving with Johnny Dumfries and Andy Wallace, and then runner-up with Wallace and Fritz Conrad in 1990. With Jaguar's withdrawal from the series, in 1992 Lammers was driving a Toyota instead, podiums at Suzuka and Magny-Cours, rescuing an unreliability-stricken season to finish up 6th overall. Despite being out of F1 for over a decade, a record for the longest gap between races he still holds as of 2024, Lammers said he was looking forward to getting back into the swing of it and still aimed for a place in a top team one day. Car 28, Nicola Larini. Just like Lammers, Larini had spent 4 years trying to show his talent in a series of substandard cars, in his case Ozella, Ligier and the Modena Lamborghini team, and when the latter folded at the end of 1991 there wasn't a racing berth for him. So instead he moved into the Italian Superturismo Championship, partnering with Alessandro Nannini at the Alfa Romeo Works team, and had won the title with an impressive run of 4 double-header wins in a row in the middle of the season, beating veteran Giorgio Francia, with Nannini 3rd overall. Ferrari have been keen to stress that Larini is expected to do no more in the last 2 races of the year than drive safely and provide feedback on the lateral gearbox and active suspension for next year. But he will be keen to demonstrate his quality, even if the F92A still isn't quite the top ride he might hope for. By the way, Sandro Nannini, winner at Suzuka in 1989, had signed terms with Ferrari before losing an arm in a helicopter accident the following year, and while the arm was stitched back on and he seemed to have found his niche in touring cars, the Scuderia did give him a run around Fiorano between races in a Lazy's number 27 F92A with a specially adapted steering wheel. What might have been. Qualifying saw Nigel Mansell equal another of Senna's records from 1988, taking his 13th pole of the season and the 30th of his career, with Friday's times determining the grid after the rain came in on Saturday. Not only was Mansell's pole time 9/10 faster than anyone else, but the top 7 on the grid were spread out over a hair over 4 seconds. Patrese, 0.859 behind Mansell, and Senna busting her gut to only be 1.015 seconds behind the leader, but Berger in 4th was 2.936 seconds off the pace, Schumacher 5th 3.562, and the low tie 3.67 and 4.055 for Herbert and Hakkinen respectively. The Ligiers had finally found some grip and were well up, Comas 8th and Boutsen 10th, bracketing a good performance by De Cesaris, and Nicola Larini outqualified Alesi at the first time of asking, though that was at least in part due to Jean blowing up an engine and then tangling with Naspetti and ending up 15th, with Brundle 13th having a bout of food poisoning and an off. The Minardis were nicely mid-pack for a change. Suzuki had the better of Alboreto on his home track, though Katayama could only manage 20th after an excursion of his own. Lammers qualified a creditable 23rd ahead of Naspetti, who also had an engine failure as well as his coming together with Alesi. Saturday's times in the wet, though, saw Alesi's second fastest after Mansell, with Lammers' 6th fastest, so clearly he wasn't as rusty as all that. Ayrton Senna remained a huge star in Japan, and while the adulation of fans was nice, it could make things difficult. Leaving the hotel on Sunday morning to head to the track on his scooter, he soon found himself besieged by fans and took refuge in the hotel shuttle bus, which in turn was so closely hemmed in that it couldn't move. Eventually a police escort arrived to rescue him and bring him to the track in time for the warm-up, where he promptly blew his second engine of the weekend. The skies were overcast and the temperature was chilly, and the rain remained possible though unlikely, and Goodyear's Lee Gowg was expecting a single tyre stop for everyone. So, with Nigel Mansell hoping to finally break his streak of bad luck in Suzuka, Patrese, Senna and Schumacher all gunning for second place in the championship, and Honda looking for a good send-off at their last home race, it was time to go. By the time the grid lined up, actually, the sun had come out, and just for once Berger's car behaved itself as they all went off for the parade lap and reassembled for the start. And off they went, with both Williamses blasting away side by side, Mansell taking the lead into turn 1, followed by the McLarens, while Larini stalled his Ferrari and stayed put, though a quick shove got him moving and he set off 30 seconds in arrears. So, it was grid order in the top 10, round lap 1. Mansell, Patrese, Senna, Berger, Schumacher, Herbert, Hakkinen, Comas, De Cesaris and Boutsen. As usual, Mansell put his foot down and started pulling away from Patrese, who still had Senna breathing down his neck. By the end of the lap, Mansell was already over 3 seconds ahead of his teammate, while Berger had dropped off Senna a little and was coming under attack from Michael Schumacher. And then, suddenly on lap 3, Senna slowed up and pulled off into a side road. For the third time this weekend he'd been let down by his engine, not the send-off Honda were after. So, last year's winner Berger took up the chase of Patrese and the hopes of Japan, as Boutsen also retired, his gearbox having failed him. By now Mansell's lead was over 5 seconds, with Patrese 8 seconds ahead of Berger, who had Schumacher and the low tie still close behind. Behind them were Comas, De Cesaris and a charging Brundle, Fittipaldi and Alesi already nearly 30 seconds behind the leader in 11th place. Guillard was another early casualty, losing the back end in the spoon curve and going backwards into the barriers, and as Mansell set a benchmark lap, then dialed things back a bit to cruise, Berger was starting to get away from Schumacher, who still had a feisty Herbert hassling him, and off-screen, Brundle had got past Comas for 7th, and Larini had battled his way up to 22nd in the evil-handling Ferrari. Berger, by now 23 seconds behind Mansell, came in for tyres on lap 11, making very sure to signal clearly this time. A typically slick McLaren stop got him out 6th behind the low tie, and while the Goodyear technicians had to look at the Austrian's old tyres, Schumacher was now cruising, his gearbox refusing to shift, and he trailed round to retire, promoting Herbert to 3rd, the highest a Lotus had been all year. But 1992 just wasn't poor Johnny's year, and his gearbox only lasted a couple more laps before he too was cruising in to retire, as Brundle pitted for tyres from 6th, a slowish stop of nearly 9 seconds, getting him back out behind Christian Fittipaldi, and local favourite Aguri Suzuki also made his stop. On fresh tyres, Brundle quickly disposed of Fittipaldi and set back off after Comas and De Cesaris, who were having a lively scrap over 5th. So now it was Mansell leading Patrese, with Mika Häkkinen taking over from Herbert to fly the Lotus flag in 3rd, his first time in the top 3, with Berger chasing, then De Cesaris and Comas, and Brundle chasing them. Comas stopped for tyres on lap 19 just as Brundle caught the pair of them and overtook the Tyrrell, hopping from 7th to 5th in one fell swoop, while Berger was now reeling in Häkkinen at a second a lap as the Finns' tyres went off. Mika peeled in on lap 22, a decent stop getting him out behind Berger, but ahead of Brundle. And then the next lap in, it was Patrese, comfortably back out without losing second place, followed by Mansell the next time around, a quick stop putting him back out still handily in the lead. Gugelmin had a big off just before the spoon curve, bouncing across the track and shedding debris, while a lazy came in for tyres. He'd been up to 7th as the others around him stopped, but his stop was good enough to get him out just ahead of Fittipaldi, who had been trying to get past when the Minardi stopped. So on lap 25, just before half-distance, Mansell led Patrese by 16.5 seconds, with Berger 6 seconds behind him in 3rd, Häkkinen 22 seconds behind Berger in 4th, Brundle 5th and Comas 6th. De Cesaris was 7th, a lazy 8th, Fittipaldi 9th, Modena 10th and Suzuki 11th, the latter three all running close together behind a lazy. A Japanese marshal had a bit of a scare as he picked up debris from Gugelmin's Jordan off the track as a lazy and co blasted past and went off to change his trousers as Patrese set fastest lap as he put the hammer down in pursuit of Mansell, who was now approaching the Fittipaldi Modena Suzuki train to lap them. Larini made his stop from back in the field as Berger continued his own charge in pursuit of Patrese, and Mansell picked his way through the Fittipaldi gang, losing time to his teammate as he did. Lammers, unseen, had been in to change his tyres and have his gear selector looked at as Berger made a second tyre stop, but still got back out comfortably ahead of Häkkinen. On lap 30, Lammers' return ended with a clutch failure, and the following lap Brundle came in for a second tyre stop. A problem on the left rear saw him stationary for 15 seconds, but he had quite a lead over 6th-placed Comas and didn't lose a place, while a lazy, now lapped, was struggling to keep a Minardi and a Jordan behind his Ferrari, which wasn't a great look for the Scuderia, though to be fair both Fittipaldi and Modena were having great races given their respective seasons so far. Mansell now began to slow, and on lap 36, while the cameras were looking elsewhere, he moved over to allow Patrese through into the lead. Just as in Monza, he'd agreed to support his teammates' championship aspirations and finally give him his first win of the year. Meanwhile, Comas had made a slight mistake at the chicane, allowing De Cesaris to get past and nab 6th, only for the Ligier to lose oil pressure and pull off anyway. Just as in Monza, Mansell stayed with Patrese, holding station just behind but occasionally closing right up and seeming to give him a hard time. Meanwhile, Gasho and Katayama had been having an entertaining inter-team battle over 11th, with the Japanese driver having got ahead when Gasho's crew fluffed his stop. But it all ended in tears when Bertrand, trying a bit too hard, got it all wrong going into the chicane and harpooned Ukio. Gasho was out on the spot, Katayama was able to make it in for new boots and a quick look over, but had lost places in the process. That was going to be an interesting team debrief. With 10 laps to go then, Patrese and Mansell were lapping together, with Berger some distance behind in 3rd, and somewhat stuck behind Modena, who was too busy chasing Fittipaldi to let him past. Häkkinen was an even more distant 4th, and losing time as his engine had lost a valve. Mansell's Suzuka curse struck again on lap 45 of 53 as a connecting rod gave way, detonating his Renault in a spectacular fashion. He pulled in, past Senna's abandoned McLaren, as on the same lap, Häkkinen's engine lost the rest of its valves and he pulled over at the hairpin, agonisingly close to Lotus's first podium since 1988. That left Patrese leading Berger by 31 seconds, with Brundle suddenly promoted to 3rd, De Cesaris to 4th, and the Alesi Fittipaldi Modena scrap to one for 5th, 6th and 7th places. Behind them, Katayama had retaken 11th from Larini, who'd had to switch off the active suspension, was just cruising to the finish, while Patrese had eased off to husband his own car. So spread out were the top 4, in fact, that barring last-minute mechanical problems there was no chance of a change at the front, with the real scrap being a lazy Fittipaldi and Modena, despite the Japanese director insisting what we all wanted to watch was the Honda-powered Berger circulating in second. And so the last 5 laps ticked down without incident. Patrese took the 6th win of his long career, and the first of a frustrating season for him, with Berger and Brundle joining him for a full podium of number 2 drivers. De Cesaris' 4th place would be a great bonus for Ken Tyrrell in front of their future Yamaha and Cabin partners and other potential future Japanese sponsors. Alesi hung on for 5th, and Christian Fittipaldi took his first career point at the age of 21 and Minardi's first of the year. Ironically, this was also the first race of the year which Christian's parents hadn't attended. Stefano Modena just missed out on Jordan's first point of their awful year. Aguri Suzuki took a good 8th after having comprehensively beaten Alboreto for a change, and indeed the Italian veteran was the last man running, crossing the line 2 laps down in 15th place. Mansell has stuck around after his retirement to congratulate Patrese. The two men hadn't always got along, but had great respect for each other, and unlike Berger the previous year, Patrese would have the satisfaction of knowing that he would have won the race regardless of Mansell's generosity. Renault had the satisfaction of beating Honda in their backyard, and Soichiro Honda's widow and Honda CEO Nobuhiko Kawamoto visited Williams to present an enormous samurai helmet. So a jubilant Patrese went back up to 2nd in the championship, 6 points ahead of Senna, as McLaren went 8 points clear of Benetton going into the last race of the season in Adelaide, another track which held nothing but bad memories for Nigel Mansell, who'd be keen to sign off his F1 career with one last win.